All right, this is going to be a bit of a quicker video comparing three of Giant Mouse's more popular knives. Three knives that look pretty similar at first glance, but end up having some subtle but very significant differences that change what each one is good at and why you might want one over the other. And those three knives, as you can see on the table here, are first, your Giant Mouse Ace Biblio. Now, there's going to be separate reviews for all of these, but just to give some brief details. So this was one of Giant Mouse's first production models. This might have been their very first production model. So this one has been around for some years. This is a version with maroon canvas micarta scales, thick scales over steel liners, contoured scales, and it's a sub 3-inch blade, but it's a bit of a chunky monkey. It's thick, it's heavy, and it sort of shows what old Giant Mouse was like in a lot of ways. Then you've got your Riv here. The Riv came out a couple years ago, and it is very much a mini version of the Biblio. If you look at the lines, especially when they're open, it's the exact same lines. The Riv is a mini Biblio. Exact same lines on the handle, exact same lines on the blade. Even the flipper tab is shaped the same way. But this one, at least the frame lock version, I'm pretty sure this liner lock version as well, was made in China rather than being made in Italy. And they've changed the way a lot of sort of the scales are manufactured, some details in how the blade is cut, things like that make it feel quite different. We'll go into those details in a second. And then you've got the Tribeca, which is a relatively newer model. I think this only came out in 2023 from Giant Mouse. Still has a flipper tab and still has a big blade, but rather than having the sheep's footy sort of blade that the Biblios have, instead has a very mild drop point with a much, much higher tip. And you've sort of got the same kind of thing that you have on, like, if you've ever seen on Chris Reeve knives, I don't have one with me, but if you look at the drop point blade shape and the Insingo blade shape, basically if you flip the drop point upside down, it becomes the Insingo. You've got that same sort of thing here, just a little bit with the Tribeca and the Biblio. If I use the same size ones, you can see it a little bit more. It's kind of the opposite blade shape of the Biblio. And so looking at these three knives together, first, it's just a useful and interesting comparison for a lot of people, but also shows some key details about Giant Mouse's sort of aesthetics, what they do, why they build knives the way they do, and also shows in some ways how they've evolved as a brand over time, which to me, they've probably seen one of the most profound and beneficial evolutions as a brand of just about any company in the knife industry, especially over the last couple years. And you'll see that in my full reviews of each of these knives. So let's start with the similarities, because the similarities are very significant between these three. So these are all knives with relatively thick, and when I say thick, I mean tall this way, handles, with relatively thick, meaning tall blades, with relatively thick blade stocks for the fact that these are smaller knives. You know, these are, I think, 125,000 blade stock across the board. They've all got flipper tabs. They all run on bearings. And they're all designed to be very utilitarian EDC style knives. To the extent, you know, some people will say a sub 3-inch knife can't be an EDC or can't be utilitarian. Those people, I just disagree with them. These are all sub 3-inch or right around 3-inch knives, and these are all excellent EDC picks that are designed to be relatively hand-filling, relatively easy to use, and very, very capable. And you see that capability in a lot of the shared design language of both the blade and the handle. So I'll take the Biblio here because it was the first. What are some things that make this such a good EDC? Well, your blade shape here, you've got a very low cutting edge relative to your hand, which makes it very easy. The cutting edge is basically in front of your hand, which makes it feel like you have lots of control over it. It's very easy to guide this cutting edge, the part back here, wherever you need it to. You've also got a very good finger choil, which lets you get right up next to this blade for detail cuts. It works really well. And then in the Biblio here, you've also got a very traditional sheep's foot with a low tip here, which is great for your drag cuts, your utility cuts, things like that. And then you've got Vox's signature jimping in the middle of the blade, which gives you that great place to rest your thumb. Then on your handle, you've got thick, heavily contoured handle scales. You've got a big front finger index here, which whether you're choking up and you're using that on your middle finger, or you're choking back and using that on your pointer finger, gives you tons of security in your hand position. Your hand is not going to move. Because it's contoured, it rolls into your hand very nicely. And then because the back of the blade hooks, or the back of the handle hooks down like this, in particular this more aggressive hook right here, and the bit of sharpness right there, your fingers, even though this is a smaller blade, your fingers, especially in this choked up position, feel very secure right in this space in the handle, and this whole thing just doesn't want to move in your hand. It ends up being a little knife that feels very, very secure in the hand, and so it's a little knife, whether you're going to pinch it, whether you're going to hold it back here, or whether you're going to choke up, that feels very capable even for tougher, heavier duty tasks. It's a really nice design. And you can see all of those design details that I just pointed out are present in these other two knives here as well. The Tribeca, it doesn't have that sheep's foot blade. Instead, it's got a very slight drop point, but you've still got a very low belly down here to give you that control for those push cuts, and even for stuff like cutting cardboard and stuff like that. I mean, when you're cutting cardboard, it's basically a big old push cut most of the time, or a sort of drag cut, and having this low edge gives you lots of control. You've still got that fantastic choil there for all that control. You've still got the jimping in the middle there, and you've still got, even though the shape is slightly different, it's a little more neutral, you've still got this big front finger index here. You've still got this fantastic front finger choil. You've still got a much more subtle, but it's still there, sort of drop toward the butt. When you think about how you actually hold this, especially in the choked up position, it's still capturing your hands in there. And you've still got those heavily contoured scales that make this whole thing feel very nice in the hand. Exact same design details, just in a slightly different package. And the Riv, even though it's much smaller, keeps all the design language of the Biblio almost to a T. The choil is obviously larger because it's a smaller knife, but still so much control, so much comfort in this choked up grip. And even in this choked back grip, it's a 3-finger knife, and a solid 3-finger knife despite being tiny. Though honestly, with a knife this small, you're always going to choke up on it, realistically. So, the result is that these are 3 knives that all end up being very, very good everyday carry picks because they all share those very nice design details that I just spoke about. None of these is a bad knife. But now let's start talking about the differences between the 3. And those differences really do make them feel like much more different knives than even the visible differences might lead you to think. So let's start by comparing, and we're going to make 2 comparisons here because the Tribeca and the Riv are very different knives. They're both differently shaped and they're significantly different sizes. So instead, we're going to compare the 2 larger ones. We're going to compare the Biblio and the Tribeca, and then we're going to compare the Biblio and the Riv. And that should really help you understand what each one of these knives is trying to do, what it does well, and where some succeed relative to others. So let's start with the Biblio and the Tribeca because that's a bit more the more obvious comparison. So the first and very obvious thing is the difference in blade shape here. This being your drop point with a lot more big belly here, and this being your sheep's foot with a more gradual belly and that lower tip. Now, what does that mean? Your Biblio here, amazing for utility cuts, and it's an EDC demon in a way. A lot of your EDC cuts are down on a table pulling like that, or going onto a piece and dragging through, things like that. This blade shape excels for that stuff. And because it's still got that belly, because it's not a true warnie, it can do your cardboard cuts, things like that, your longer cuts, and stay in the cut through very naturally. And because it's a full flat grind here and it's a relatively tall blade, it does get quite thin behind the edge. So it does those cuts well. But the Tribeca, with this drop point blade shape, with this huge belly, excels in stuff like breaking down cardboard, or cutting through carpet, or a lot of your home improvement type tasks. Because this long belly, when you're doing your long gradual cuts, it just stays in the cut so naturally, and it will just tear through extended cuts with no effort whatsoever. This is actually one of the best knives that I have ever handled for breaking down boxes and cardboard in particular. The way that this blade allows the blade to naturally follow your hand movement as you make those extended cuts is remarkable. And combine that with how naturally sharp this blade is just because of the geometry, really, really excels at that. Now what you're giving up is because this tip is higher, it's much more effort to do those drag cuts, those utility cuts, things like that, because rather than the tip being down here, the tip is up here, so you have to cant your wrist much more. As a result, this feels like a really, really good EDC knife that can do non-EDC tasks. This feels like a really, really good, especially for a small knife, this feels like a really, really good harder use small knife, or a more sort of general purpose knife, the Tribeca here, that can do EDC if you need to. So these are a bit the inverse of each other in terms of their ideal use case while still being able to do what the other one does. The second difference, which I'll go over because it's the little more minor of the last two here, is your flipper tab. And the flipping action of these ends up being very, very different. The Biblio, somewhat notoriously, has a very sharp flipper tab. It's perpendicular to the blade when it's closed, with pretty sharp jimping there, and this thing will catch and grab your finger like nobody's business, and it's very easy to flip open. No effort, no thought whatsoever. If you're just dragging your finger across the back of the knife naturally, you're going to catch that flipper tab, and the detent is strong enough, it will pop out easily. Now, this does make this very, very pokey, both on your finger and in your pocket. And it's also, it's heavily jimped. It's also functioning as a finger guard. That's part of why it's so tall. But it is a less comfortable, less elegant flipper tab, but it's very, very effective. The Tribeca, on the other hand, the flipper tab actually curves away from you. It slopes gradually away. It's got some jimping here, but the whole thing curves away. It's almost like a wave that's cresting. And so this one, you really have to pull back. You got to push down and pull back to get this thing to fly out. The detent is very nice and crisp, and it will fly out very naturally once you get that detent right. But it takes a lot more effort to get the Tribeca to fire out than it does the Biblio. The Biblio is almost effortless to fire out. The Tribeca, you have to be very deliberate. Now, when you open them up, you'll see the other design detail here, though. Because this flipper tab in both knives is also functioning as a finger guard and part of the choil. This choil, it's nice, it's functional, but it's a little rough. It's basically just a semicircle cutout here. It's a little rough on this end. The Biblio, everything about it is a little rough. It's a work knife. It feels like a work knife. It's not polished in that way. The Tribeca, you can see when it's deployed, it's really, that flipper tab is meant to be a finger guard and part of the choil primarily. The way these lines flow, both with this nice, elegant sweeping choil and this really nice sweeping finger guard here, it's meant to enhance this particular grip position. And it does. It happens to be able to work as a flipper tab as well, but between the two, this one, they both work as slow rollers or spidey flickers as well. The Tribeca here, just to show. But the Biblio is much more of a flipper, and the Tribeca is much less of a flipper, and I'm much more comfortable opening it this way. But then the biggest difference between the two is the way that they are fit and finished. And that comes down to country of origin as well. This one's made in, actually, I'm not even sure where the Tribeca is made, so I'm not gonna mention that specifically. I forget that at the moment, but there are major differences in the fit and finish between these two. The Biblio is an example of early giant mouse. As I said a minute ago, it's utilitarian. The way the scale, the liners sit and things like that, they're flush, but they're not perfectly flush. Like all your radii don't exactly match and things like that. That hole there, the opening hole, is not really knocked down. Your blade spine is crowned, but only a little bit. Everything's just a little harsh. And then the biggest detail is your liners are not nested. So this ends up being a very thick knife, both in the hand and the pocket, because you've got these thick micarta contoured scales, and then you've got relatively thick steel liners, and it's all stacked up. So you've got a relatively thin blade with these giant, thick handles. Now, that makes it great in the hand, ergonomically very nice, but it does make it a huge chunk in the pocket and also makes it heavy. So this is a little knife that ends up being a pocket hog. The Tribeca, on the other hand, first off, fit and finish is just on a different level. All these chamfers, all this contouring is just more nicely done, more consistent. The contours are more aggressive. The blade finishing is significantly nicer. Your plunge is nicer. Everything's much more nicely crowned. That opening hole is nicely rounded off, excuse me. Even the interiors are more nicely finished, but the biggest detail is now the liners are nested. And so these are G10 scales, but this knife ends up being not, the scales are not that thick. And so it's not a ton thicker than the blade. It's also not a light knife, but it's also not a heavy knife, and it feels a little bit more balanced. And so really the big difference, just to show that thickness difference, if you look at these two, the Giant Mouse Biblio, let's get it right there, is about half a scale thicker than the Tribeca. It doesn't seem like a lot, but in the pocket makes a really big difference. This thing the Biblio feels chunky and feels big in the pocket. The Tribeca does not. And so the Tribeca ends up feeling more refined, more polished overall, not just physically, because these scales happen to be a little polished and the blade is nicely stone washed, but just feels nicer put together. The Biblio, especially in 2024, is a fantastically designed work knife, but it really does feel like a work knife where the fit and finish came secondary. And then on top of that, to add all of that up, the Tribeca, in most places, is going to be a little bit cheaper than the Biblio, which makes that fit and finish difference feel a little harder to swallow. This knife is, you're not getting a value for the Biblio in 2024. So those are the differences between the Tribeca and the Biblio. Fantastic work knife, primarily for EDC, that can also do other stuff and is a little chunky. That's your Biblio. The Tribeca is a knife that is great at that general purpose stuff that can also do EDC, and it's significantly more refined, with the caveat that the way that they chose to do this flipper tab, which is really mostly a finger choil and a finger guard, makes it more of primarily a thumb opener and sort of secondarily a flipper. So that's your differences there. Both great knives, and different enough knives that I can see a place for both of them in a collection. So now let's compare the Biblio to the Riv. I keep wanting to call it the Rio. These, you would think, are very similar knives, and the design of them is very similar. You can literally see, looking at these, the Riv is a tiny Biblio. All of the major design lines between these two knives are identical. The way the tip curves up is the same, the spine of the blade is the same, all the gear curves on the handles are the same, even the shape of the flipper tab is the same. But the big difference between these two, other than the size, is again the fit and finish. So let's just jump right to that, and then we'll talk about the size a bit. The Riv, much like the Tribeca, is a modern Giant Mouse, meaning it's got nested liners. Everything is nicely crowned. This hole is nicely knocked down. It's got a nice plunge. Your internals are more nicely finished. The contouring is a little bit more aggressive. And so all of that leads to a knife that is slim in the pocket, that is light, and that just feels a little bit more finished throughout than the Biblio. This knife doesn't feel rough. This knife is no less capable. This blade shape, for all the reasons I said for the Biblio, is still fantastic for EDC tasks. One of the best EDC blade shapes out there. But whereas with the Biblio, you're sort of tolerating a lack of finish to get the level of performance that this gives you, you don't have that issue with the Riv. The Riv feels very nicely made, especially given this is a sub $200 knife in this micarta version, most places. So That, again, if I do the thickness comparison, it's even more dramatic here. The Riv is just very significantly thinner than the Biblio, and even more than the length and size, it's that thickness difference and the weight difference of having smaller nested liners that makes the Riv feel much smaller. And then just to talk about the size, because, the size is obvious. The Riv is a dramatically smaller knife, but what they've done with the Riv, you can see the choil is bigger, the butt is a little bit more neutral. The Biblio is well known for being a relatively small knife in terms of length that feels like a big knife, for all the reasons I said. Mostly because this handle design and because of how capable this blade shape is, especially this choke-up position, you feel like you're getting more than 3 inches of blade here, and you can push this into larger tasks. The Riv is a tiny knife. This is, not that much bigger than something like a Dragonfly. But that same design language, especially in the more neutral form here, you get the same experience where this feels like a 3-inch knife. This feels like a very capable larger knife. If I pull out my small Sebenza here, small Sebenza is a much larger knife than the Riv. But functionally, when I'm gripping this and using it, it feels larger. The Riv does make this feel like a big blade, but not nearly as much as you might think. And so the Biblio ends up being sort of a small knife that you can push into larger tasks. The Riv is a very small knife that you can push into pretty decent EDC tasks. And a lot of small knives start to struggle when you go outside your basic EDC. If I pull out something like, your Baby Banter, this knife, great as a letter opener, sucks as anything other than a letter opener or anything other than, boxes and stuff like that. This thing doesn't. And so the way they've slimmed it down, the way they've refined it, makes it even better at that primary purpose than the Biblio. This feels like an even more refined version. And so the biggest difference here, while the size is important, what the Riv really does is show how good this design is, that it can scale so effectively down to this smaller size. But what puts the Riv over the top is that additional level of fit and finish, which accentuates all the strengths of the Biblio, while making it have some strengths that the Biblio lacks. In particular, the pocket profile of the Riv is one of those knives that disappears in the pocket. You will not notice if you are carrying it. You always notice if you're carrying the Biblio. It is just so thick. It is so heavy. It feels like carrying. You remember when you were a kid and you carried rocks in your pocket? This feels like carrying a rock in your pocket. This feels like carrying a pebble in your pocket. So, those are the major differences between these 3 Giant Mouse knives, which again are 3 of their most popular knives, and sort of gives you a bit of insight into how the brand has evolved over time. I quite like all 3 of these knives. I think that these are 3 of the best knives that Giant Mouse makes, and honestly, I think that these are 3 of the most recommendable knives on the market in this price point, particularly for an EDC or adjacent to EDC use case. And I think most people in the knife community will be very happy with any of these. This is not about telling you which one is best. I don't think anyone is best. I think that there are particular use cases for each one. And just to sort of summarize quickly, Biblio, we'll start with that one because it came first. The Biblio is your relatively small knife that it is a workhorse, It is the least refined of the 3 in terms of fit, finish, construction, and design details. But boy, oh boy, does it do those EDC tasks well. The problem is you're paying for it with a knife that is chunky in the pocket. Great in the hand, but chunky in the pocket. The Riv is even more tiny than you would think because of how much they've slimmed it down, because of how much they've refined it. But because of how good this design is, ends up much like the Biblio, feels bigger than it actually is. The Riv feels bigger than it actually is. And rather than doing it in a way that fills up more of your pocket than you'd expect, this one fills up less of your pocket than you'd expect. And so it ends up being a very exceptional EDC and small knife. And then the Tribeca takes a lot of the genetics of the Biblio and shifts it more from being an EDC knife to more of a general purpose knife. And really, again, does show how good these bones are and ends up being, for the tasks where this Biblio blade shape and this Biblio handle design where they are very good, but it's not their specialty, really shows that when you put a more traditional drop point blade on there and you put a handle that is a little bit more neutral and so a little bit more dynamic, meaning you can move your hand up and down and then you refine it all and slim it all down, you have a really exceptional general purpose knife. And so these all have their strengths. They'll have a little bit of weaknesses, but as long as you know what you're getting, I can see just about everybody who carries knives regularly and likes using knives finding a lot of enjoyment in at least one and maybe even two of these. And so, give them a look. Again, I will have full reviews coming up for each one of these three and for a bunch more giant mouses. I basically went and got a bunch of giant mouses for the purpose of reviewing them. And by the way, if it's not clear, I am personally purchasing everything that I review. I will sell most of what I review after I review it, but I, at this point, am not getting anything from manufacturers at all. I'm not getting discounts on anything. I'm buying everything off the secondary market, so I'm usually paying below retail, and then I'm selling it back on the secondary market, and hopefully making back what I paid. So I have owned every single one of these. I have used every single one of these, and there's my conclusion. So hopefully this was useful, and if it wasn't useful, hopefully it was at least entertaining, and a good use of 26 minutes of your time. This was Clark the Knife. Hope to see you again soon.